that, mostly what that tells me is I've been doing this a really long time, is what I think that works. So, oh wait, where's my, yeah, there we go. All right, I might even use the laser pointer. Yeah, yay. Okay, so, a number of years ago, I read an article by a guy named Stephen Jay Gould, who was an evolutionary biologist at Harvard, and the article just fascinated me, and it has always stuck with me. And it was about the concept of spandrels. And he says that the spandrel starts out as an architectural concept. So you can see up here, these little areas are spandrels. And what they are is they are the spaces that are structurally necessary. They have to be there, but they weren't planned for. They're not the reason, they didn't build this to put those spaces there. They didn't design it to have those spaces there. Instead, those spaces must be there. But one of the things that Gould points out is that because they are there, the artists and the architects who then approach them often create some of the most beautiful works of art in those spaces. And they create them specifically because they must. Because there's no choice to creating them. That is the space they must be. That is the shape they must be. So in cathedrals, most of the most beautiful stained glass windows, in fact, are spandrels. They're things that are architecturally necessary for them to be there. So most of the structure of this window, for example, which is all stone and immensely heavy, has to be structured that way. It couldn't have been done as a big open structure in the middle. It had to be subdivided. And these little windows underneath, they had to be there in order to support it. And the fact that these had to be arched and those little circles had to be there, they couldn't have been otherwise. They had to be that way. And so the beauty of these works of art, the beauty of that stained glass window, is largely a function of the fact that the structure around it made it that way, which then inspired the creation of more beautiful, more elevated works of art. He then extends this concept into evolution, which was his field after all. And in the field of evolution, he says that there are also evolutionary spandrels. So we have to remember that contrary to the way we use the word evolution, evolution isn't about motion towards perfection. Instead, evolution is about adaptation to context, adaptation to the environment. It is, in other words, the way in which the species must react to the situation that it finds itself in. And because of that, a lot of species developed adaptations which turn out to be useful for many other reasons. So, for example, feathers are originally evolved because they're the only structure that can make the bird light enough so the bird can fly. But feathers have many other uses, like, for example, insulation, keeping the bird warm and allowing it to survive over the winter, even in places like Minnesota. Or the enormous rack on an elk, which are developed for defense and for mating purposes, also cause it to build up these huge muscles around its neck and the hump and shoulders, which then allowed the animal to be able to move higher into the mountains, which protected it from predators and allowed it to access things it could never otherwise have access for food. These are all responses to their surroundings. And my point today is, I think this is vocation. I think that vocation, this is evolutionary vocation. It's spandrel vocation, because we are the spandrels. We are the beautiful works that are created as a result of the context that we find ourselves in. So because I'm a victim of my discipline, I'm going to have three main points. To do this one, they will not be show up, do the work, and keep in touch. They will be three different points. They are going to be instead the big good lie. They are going to be creating and discovering, and they are going to be having and wanting, aka the queering of vocation. So if we want to think about, let's see, am I up to my, there we go. If we want to think about what we tell our kids, if you don't already know this, I'm sorry to tell you, but your mother was wrong, Mick Jagger was right. You can't always be what you want. You can't grow up to be anything you want. When I was a kid, sure, I wanted to be an astronaut. I was too tall. No spacesuits at the time, over 5'10". I wanted to be Michael Jordan. I was too short. Also, no athleticism. I wanted to be Thomas Jefferson. And then I learned about, slaves and Sally Hemings, so maybe not so much. I wanted to be Leonardo da Vinci. Still kind of want to be Leonardo da Vinci. That's not, by the way, that's by Michelangelo, but it was said that that was modeled after Leonardo da Vinci. That when Leonardo da Vinci was a young man, that statue was modeled after him, the David was. So, not too bad. I'm not quite that fit, but why do we tell this lie? Why do we tell kids they can be anything they want? I say it's a lie, but I say it's a good lie. It's a good lie because we say it to the kids because we don't know what they can become. I don't know what I can become. We don't know what they're going to want to do. I still don't know what I'm going to want to do. If we were to impose that on them, we would be imposing on them an external constraint that they aren't choosing, that we don't really know it's there. It's like we would be creating constraints that might not even exist, right? So instead, how do we go about finding the constraint? If we are living spandrels, how do we find our constraints? And my point is the only way that we do that is by trying, by living and by doing. By living and doing, we test our limits. By living and doing, we find out where the real constraints of our context are. So about 25 years ago, the Librarian of Congress, a guy named Daniel Borstein, wrote 2 books that were a really big deal at the time. They were also really, really big fat books. And one of them was called The Creators, and one was called The Discoverers. And it seems to me this is a problem that has bothered me about vocation for years. Is vocation something that we discover? Like, is it an object that's out there someplace, like a tomb of a pharaoh that you can go find? Or is it something we create? Are we artists given a blank canvas and we get to create ourselves however we want? Well, Mick Jagger tells us it's not that first one, right? We don't get to create whatever we want. And we don't really discover it because it's not something that we can find as we go along. It's something we are both creating and discovering, but we can only create it after we've discovered. So for example, in my own case, as most of you know, I went to law school, and when my second year of law school, I had a crisis. I say this in a humorous way now, it was not humorous at the time. It was a very serious crisis. I was super depressed, I was very anxious, I was totally unlike myself. I stopped attending classes for almost a month and a half. So I went to see this psychologist over at the U, and he was like every stereotype of the Lutheran psychologist. He was literally wearing hush puppies, if you remember what those are. He had a beige corduroy jacket with patches on it. He had gray hair, long gray hair and a ponytail and a gray beard. And I went in and I spilled my guts out to this guy. And he was sort of like looking around the room. And I finally got mad, and I just said, "Is my life crisis boring you?" And he kind of swivels back to me, and he's like, "Yeah, a bit." And I was like, "What the hell?" And I said, "Well, what do you think I should do then?" And he said, "Well, I think you are an organism." And I was like, "What does that mean?" And he said, "I think you are an organism, and like all organisms, you respond to the stimuli that are around you, and you have taken yourself out of the context in which you were receiving the stimuli you needed to be able to make a good decision. So you got to go back into that context, and in that context, you will learn things about yourself, and that will allow you to make a decision." So I did that. I went back. I doubled down, I got through law school, I passed the bar, I got a lawyery job, and then a year and a half later, I was doing the lawyery job at 2 a.m., and I was working on, of all things, an arbitration brief for factory workers that wanted to be able to work multiple 4-hour shifts. And I was arguing they shouldn't because sleep deprivation was bad, but I was working on this brief at 2 a.m. And I said, this is not what I want to be doing. Like this, the thought that came into my head was, this is not how I want to spend my time. This does not seem like a good use of my time. And then I started reflecting on what did seem like a good use of my time. And ultimately I realized, oh, it was this. It was teaching. It was back when I was in the classroom in grad school. That was the thing that seemed like a good use of my time. But again, I didn't know that. I couldn't have figured that out until I had done that. And I spent a lot of time, and people always ask me, oh, do you regret going to law school? Do you regret becoming an attorney? I'm like, no, because if I hadn't done it, I wouldn't have known, and I wouldn't have felt good about where I am now. And then, when we were kids, my brother and my friends and I, we were big Star Trek fans, original Star Trek, classic Trek. And somehow when we played, I always ended up being Spock. And I didn't really want to be Spock. I didn't necessarily object to being Spock, but I didn't really want to be Spock. I kind of wanted to be Captain Kirk or sometimes Scotty. But somehow I always ended up being Spock, and I kind of knew that was right. I kind of knew that was the right way to do it. Well, and then there's this one episode where Spock kind of goes nuts because he has this whole mating thing. It's called the amok time. And he's supposed to marry this woman, but he ends up realizing he didn't really want to marry this woman. And the woman that she actually wants to marry this guy named Stan, who we can see there. That's Stan. And so this episode just stuck in my head, and I wasn't quite sure why, but that quote also stuck in my head, that having is not the same as wanting. And I've had so many occasions in my life where I thought I knew what I wanted until I had it, and then I wanted something else. And that includes everything from being a lawyer to originally wanting to be, as Momita knows, wanting to be a physicist. I wanted to be a physicist originally, but it also includes thinking I was straight when I wasn't, after being married for 12 years, and that's tough. And it seems to me that these kinds of rules we have about what we think of as vocation, and we try to separate our vocation from who we are personally, that ain't going to work, because you're depriving yourself of the stimulus, of the information you need to be able to make the good decisions. And if I try to deprive my professional life of who I am outside of my professional life, I will not be who I really am. And as a result, I can't wholly be present when I'm teaching. Somebody now, although I am divorced, I am also more myself in the classroom. I don't even know if the students know. It doesn't even matter if they know. What matters is that I know, and that I am in harmony, I'm in accord with myself now. And so I teach now in a way that I never was able to teach before. And that again is a discovery of who I am, of the sort of constraints of who I am that allow me to be the person that I am. And I don't think this process ever stops. Over spring break, my mom, who's 91 years old and who is having some medical issues this morning, over spring break, she told me that for the first time she would let me put her painting and her sketches together into a portfolio that I could submit to an art gallery. And I'd been trying to get her to do that for years because she's an amazing artist, but she has never been willing to put herself out there. And now at the age of 91, she is willing to put herself out there. And that just, it just means so much to me. It moves and inspires me, like she is who I want to be. We went to Barcelona a couple of years ago, my mom and my brother and my son and I, and while we were there, we got to see the magnificent cathedral, the Sagrada Familia. And the Sagrada Familia, if you don't know it, is a really fascinating architectural thing. The guy made it basically to try to create as many spandrels as possible. And I think that if you do that, if you accept those constraints, you discover those constraints, we are then in the process of discovering who we are so we can make choices about who we want to be. And by doing that, we can create in ourselves works of ourselves that are both authentic and profoundly beautiful. Thank you.